Q, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am Kiel. Pronouns are he slash him. Best of luck.
All right. But do refer to the panel as a whole. I will be putting timestamps in chat, but please do time yourselves and your opponents for POI purposes. For the motion, the House, as Putin will fully withdraw from the special military operation in Ukraine. PM, here.
Okay, am I audible and clear?
Yep.
Okay, good to hear. Then let me adjust my headphones. Okay, then starting my speech in 3, 2. Russia is fighting a pointless war today in 2023. And I'm here going to tell you today as a PM of why Putin has the incentives to withdraw from Ukraine. So let me get started first into my setup. Okay, so the definition of fully withdraw is to withdraw all assets, equipment, and manpower. This is the only thing that really needs definition in this debate. So now that I'm done with that, let me get into characterization in today's debate. First of all, okay, that Ukraine is pushing back Russia in Ukraine. So why is this happening here? Okay, counter offensives and Russia and Ukraine obtaining Western military support, such as equipment such as Javelin, Bradley's Leopard 2, that is instrumental in their attacks to push back Russia. So not only that, they also receive Western support via economic aid. They receive funds and everything, and also not to mention they receive training from Western powers. And so what happens is that due to Wagner not fighting in the Ukraine war, as already said, in the info slide, there is Russia has lost a lot of capability, and they're fighting a losing war, wasting more resources and human life. I'll accept your POI later. And so what happens is that it is very clear now that Russia is on the defensive. Russia is wasting more and more resources building defensive structures instead of going on the offensive and trying to win the war. They are fighting a grinding stalemate that is very clear that they're losing resources for practically nothing. I'll accept your POI now.
What is your stance on Russian-controlled regions that are not in Ukraine, such as the Crimea?
The Crimea part isn't or hasn't been part of Russia. And what happens is that Russia will pull back from Crimea because it is not part of it. And as said, it will fully withdraw. That means all parts of Ukraine, such as Crimea, from the 2014 Crimea invasion. Now, let me continue. Russia's economy right now is taking a hard hit from economic sanctions and trade tariffs from the Western powers. So how does this look like? Russia's imports, Russia's exports are all being blocked or even taxed heavily. This disincentivizes them from trading with Russia, and it hurts their economy overall. And so what happens is that now that I'm done with about how Russia is losing this war, let me get onto why even if we stop this war, Ukraine won't invade Russia. First of all, 3 layers are to go under this. Okay, first of all, Ukraine will not harm Russia because of one major reason, and that is if they invade Russia, there is no more incentives for Western powers to assist them anymore. It is very clear that once they start invading without a reason, they are only fighting to get back their land. There is no more incentive to go past Russia and into Moscow, because by that they're overstretching themselves and they're also hurting themselves critically. They're ruining their image and reputation if they go into Russia, because currently right now the main notion about the Russia-Ukrainian war is that the Ukrainians are on the defensive, pushing Russian back out of their country. And so what happens is that why is it more likely on the upside here that they are actually going to invade Russia, and it's more likely? First of all, okay, when they continue here, they harm more Ukrainians. That is an undeniable fact. And what happens is that when they harm more Ukrainians and more death continues, there will be more detachment towards Russia as a whole. And so if this continues, the Ukrainians have an incentive to invade Russia because they want revenge and they are unhappy. Sorry, by the way, my timer stopped for some reason. Anyways. So what happens is that anti-Russia sentiment here, it makes life harder and increases public disdain for Putin, because I am getting sanctioned, I can't get that much money, inflation is around, I am not happy. And so what happens that something that my second speaker will later continue is that this will cause backlash, protests, and riot. Okay, now we'll get onto my argument. So what happens is that this major part here is about how Russia has a likelihood of regaining trade routes and recuperating itself. So what happens is that Russia here is a major export of gas and oil. As long as they pull out, they have more pro-Russia sentiment. It's easier to get a better light or better sentiment when you are not actively invading a country. And so what happens is that it's easier for Russia to portray itself in a more positive light and get more support. And even wait a second, not now. And so what happens is that, not to mention Western powers, US, UK, all those European unions, they have an incentive to re-establish connection because there is also less backlash. There's no incentive right now to re-establish connections because the amount of backlash done by supporting Putin fueling a war will be incredibly immense. By Russia pulling out of it, what happens is that there'll be less backlash because they'll be like, hey, he pulled out, he's no longer fighting, and so they'll they have more of an incentive to regain it because there's also the issue about gas and oil. And so what happens is that, okay, even if there's no re-establishment of any things or anything between the Western powers and Russia, okay, we still have trade. This is mutual on both sides, okay. But however, the delta is here that instead of wasting resources on the war, okay, our side will be able to use these materials here to go and recuperate advanced technology and also and also be able to recuperate the military in order to fuel Putin's further incentives and what goals he might want to achieve. And so with that, there are two impacts on long term and short term. Okay, the first impact of the long term is that so long as Putin has resources to recuperate everything, advanced technologies, and less chance of heavy sanctions, there is a less likely chance of wait a second, I'll take it after 5 minutes. And there is a less amount of public disdain, there's less public discourse. And so what happens is that Putin is able to maintain its incentive analysis of his character to maintain power and for Russia to become a global power. And so what happens that short term is that Russia will not be in a conflict. They will be wasting less resources. They are going to be able to recuperate itself and the economy is allowed to recover. I'll take a POI now.
So what you're saying is that if Russia pulls out of the war in Ukraine that they started a year ago, the West are just going to come to their senses and say, hey, Putin, you're actually not so bad. Let's be friends.
No, of course, it won't be. That's the best case scenario. However, we've already pointed out in the worst case scenario, we're still able to recuperate more because we still have allies like China and so forth. And so what happens is that short term here, as shown, you cannot say that, hey, all the buddies coming over. No, that won't happen, obviously, but there will still be re-establishment of ties instead of currently there is no ties between Russia and the Western powers. And so what happens is that short-term impacts is that on the upside here is that he will still lose power. Okay, the war is inevitable that is going to be a Russian defeat. Okay, as we've seen here, because Ukraine right now is launching counter-offensives, pushing Russia back. And so what happens is that slowly but surely, by continuing the war, he is fighting a losing battle and eventually going to lose power and lose lose control as a whole. And as said, character incentives, Putin doesn't want to lose power. He still wants to maintain power as the president of Russia. And so short-term impacts of this action here is that we are able to recuperate and we are able to grow Russia as a whole in order to further any goals that Russia wishes to achieve. Thank you. Proud to propose.
Thank you for the speech. Welcoming Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, I go by he, him. I prefer verbal POIs. Let me just set up my timer real quick. All right. Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, yeah. Panel, government argues from a stance ignoring all of Putin's interests by conceding to a POI that they will leave Crimea and lose all of their geopolitical influence. We don't understand how they believe that Russia pulling out will suddenly make the West love Russia, right? So our stance today, as Putin, we believe that it is the the only legitimate way for him to stay in power is to continue the military operation in Ukraine. A few points of framing before I move on. Firstly, we don't need to prove that Russia will win the war. Just that if Russia were to at this point in time execute a full withdrawal, that would cause more harm than good. It is never our burden to defend that Ukraine would invade Russia or anything like that, right? Secondly, it was never our burden to defend the Russian economy whatsoever. We are only defending Putin's incentive in this debate. Thirdly, government needs to explain why it's worthy for Putin to take the risk of losing power at the cost of losing all geopolitical influence by Russia in Eastern Europe. A few points of characterization before I move on. So the Wagner Group's action is inherently challenging the legitimacy and authority of Putin's position of power in Russia. So regardless of whether they succeeded, the fact that Putin's authority is challenged within Russia is a significant event that will influence Putin's power in the future. So secondly, what does a full military withdrawal look like? It's not just about stopping your attacks and rolling back troops. Right? It involves more than that. It looks like conceding sovereign claim over lands like Crimea and Donbass. It may also look like allowing neighboring countries to even retain Russian territories that they might have conquered during the conflict. It may also look like increased Western sanction and reparations towards Russia for starting a war. A few points of rebuttals for Prime Minister. Firstly, we think that case in general doesn't really target Putin's interests, but only Russia's interest in a very Western perspective, right? They say that if we don't stop invading Ukraine, the detachment in Ukraine would increase and that would harm Russia. Firstly, we tell that this is already like present, right? If Russia has already killed thousands of Ukrainians, displaced millions of Ukrainians from their homes, we don't see how that stopping this war will stop Ukrainians from detesting Putin and Russia as a whole, right? So even if that is true, pulling out of the military operation makes Russia a more vulnerable state against Ukrainian attacks. Secondly, the economy, they say that the economy gets better because Putin is already wasting a lot of efforts, a lot of resources in the war, right? So we don't see how that is Putin's interest, right? They never really draw the link on how this is Putin's interest. And we tell that Putin is clearly okay with hurting the Russian economy by waging war against Ukraine in the first place, right? So secondly, it's not even good for Russia, right? If you lose like influence over Eastern Europe in the long term, the West influence would mean that you wouldn't get any economic growth in the long term. So yeah, with that said, I'll move on to my arguments now. Firstly, the withdrawal would catalyze inevitably Putin's fall from power. So Putin's reign is a definition of a dictatorship regime, right? So a few points of characterization of Putin as an actor and its interest, right? So firstly, the purpose of the military operation by Putin is purpose for two things. Firstly, stop the action of West and NATO in neighboring countries and to combat NATO influence. Secondly, to stay in power by creating a common enemy for the Russian state. So we tell that Putin's stay in power is contingent upon the military operations for a few reasons, right? Firstly, his image is basically all in on this war, right? The image that he portrays that he's not conceding in the instance of retaliating against the West and NATO for not being like acceptable with Ukraine joining NATO. And all these like image that he portrays, like he's not conceding, he's a big man, right? Basically. So if he withdraws from Russia, if he withdraws from Ukraine, it is a significant blow for Putin to concede and draw off the war. So then moving to analysis, right? Putin's pro-war sentiment through propaganda in Russia is extremely strong, right? He's perceived as a strongman leader that protects Russian. He's protecting Russian land. He's protecting it's basically nationalism, right? Basically. So Putin's specific message towards Russian people is basically fear-mongering against Western values and influence, right? For example, he was saying that if you pull out of the war, Russian people will end up in a worse off way, right? For example, no food, no water, no land, all this kind of propaganda stuff. So this means that a considerable and significant amount of Russians actually do support the war in Ukraine. So secondly, Wagner Group's support is actually derived from the idea that Putin is losing the war and making concessions towards the West, right? The only reason why Wagner Group is able to garner a decent amount of support from Russians is because they believe that Putin might perhaps be losing the war, and that is the only source of support from these rising groups within Russia's own country, right? So what is the impact? The consequence of this is that the polarized Russian citizens and political scene due to the war, there's going to be a big chunk of anti-war and pro-war Russian citizens, right? So we tell that the propaganda by Putin is built upon all the messages above that are stated. And if Putin concedes and pull out of the war, the backlash that Putin faces is incredible. It shows that Putin failed as a leader, and what this would result is that Russian people replacing him with somebody else, right? Not just in terms of the people in Russia, but also ministers in the Kremlin would also lose faith towards Putin, right? The unique Russian political scene means that power is actually not given by the people, but by high-profile high-profile ministers and oligarchs in Russia, right? So if Putin actually draws out of this pull out of the war, right, it will give him a negative image, which will allow other high-profile office ministers to take advantage of this and to gain power in Russia. So secondly, how does combating the West and Wagner Group how is that beneficial for Putin to stay in power? Firstly, we tell that by having a common enemy for an illegitimate dictatorship is not unfamiliar throughout history. For the CCP, this looks like them antagonizing Taiwan, the West, and also bringing up geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea, right? This is to make sure that people within China don't have time to focus on their own internal political affairs, but instead divert their attention towards the global and towards enemies around outside of the country. For the Soviet Union, this is the same as done in the past, and we don't see how this is not going to be repeated by Putin in status quo. So by having a common enemy, effectively distracts all Russians from questioning the legitimacy of Putin. It solves a large chunk of internal scrutiny that Putin would face if he concedes the war. So even if they lose the war, we tell that it's better for Putin to lose than to surrender to the West, specifically for Putin himself. Why is this important? A Putin who survives yet is severely weakened is not better than Putin that lost while defending the state of Russia. At the very least, for the people of Russia, he will be seen as a leader that has tried and fought for the Russian state. But on the other side, this allows Putin's political enemies to take advantage of this and to throw him out of power, right? So secondly, on the outcome of withdrawal from Ukraine, this is in terms of international harm and economic harm that Putin would fear the most, right? Firstly, we tell that Putin's image and Russian influence in the global sphere is significant in status quo, right? Even though they are severely weakened by the war, we tell that they still pose, they are still a superpower in status quo. So the analysis is that it is actually the worst time for Putin to concede to the West, because the West are currently in a very good position and Russia is in a disadvantaged position, right? So Russia, for example, Russia is not really succeeding in this war, we can see that, but they're actually slowly adapting to sanctions by the West, right? I.e., Russian economy is slowly improving and they are less affected by Western sanctions, right? So, but the problem is the West is actually significantly stronger than Russia as of now, which means that the consequence of this is that if Putin withdraws from the war, right, the Russian state wouldn't stop their interest in neighboring countries, right? Like, for example, the Eastern Europe region is still extremely important for Russia and they need international geopolitical strength to survive. But if he surrenders now, this means that he will lose a significant chunk of geopolitical influence and he will face international consequence. For example, increased trade embargoes and blockade as a punishment against Russia, like Germany in World War II, right? So with that being said, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, PM. Welcoming. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Alo. Welcoming DPM. Here.
I was curious. Am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, opposition. Oh, sorry. Time my speech in 3. Oh wait. Prefer general pronouns data man. Yeah. POIs verbally. Time my speech in 3, 2, 1. What opposition wants is for Putin's country, Putin's Russia, to be completely depleted of all resources, all military power, and in the end, for them to be able to be taken advantage of, the West that they hate so much, right? A couple responses to the case that the opposition have given us, right? Their case is contingent on the fact that their case is only contingent upon the fact that right now the Russian most of their case is contingent upon the fact that of the messaging of Putin that gives us, right? We think that we agree on the fact, right? We agree on the fact that most of the fear mongering that Putin creates is against the West, right? But recognize what is going to happen when the people on the ground realize that the people we are losing against is exactly the Western people, right? And why is exactly the economy something that should be considered in this debate? It's because of Putin wanting to stay in power, right? Staying in power means having having the support of the people on the ground, right? We think that yes, even if you have a fear mongering fear-mongering ability against anti-Western propaganda, right? We think that people with their survival instinct, if they realize that the economy is getting worse, right? People are having worse lives, right? It's harder to put food on the table. And all of this is because of the war that Putin is currently not putting out. It's because of the war that people are increasing trade sanctions, that people are suffering on the ground, right? We think that on your side is where the anti-Russian sentiments in like your country itself becomes worse, right? That is when like that is only on your case where the politicians that you want, the other politicians in like Russia, which you want to talk about, have more advantage to say, look, Putin is wasting our resources right now, right? The smarter thing to do would be to reincorporate our military, right? Would be to take to be withdraw right now, wait for another time when Russia gets like is able to increase our own military power, find another mercenary, right? And then only are we able to beat the West, right? We think that like that is what we want to talk about, right? A couple like reinforcing the setup that we talked about, right? We think that like public scrutiny towards Ukraine is going to be so much worse on your side, right? Like the things that we there is always going to be a possibility that Russia is able to like make their image a bit better, right? Because recognize the incentives that the government opposition did not tackle about how Russia is going to be some more like is going to be a superpower, like a global superpower that they are admitted to, which is why there is incentive for other superpowers like the US or like other European countries to have these like trades with Russia, right? We think that it's so much worse on their side when Russia is essentially depleted of all resources and they realize that the only chance they have is towards these like countries, right? In that to have like established trade with these countries, right? We take it that turn, it makes it so much worse when other countries are going to take advantage of this vulnerable state that Russia is in and actually like try to take advantage of like their economy, right? No, thank you. Second thing about how Ukrainians are like on your side, it's highly likely chance for Ukrainians to actually advance further and want to like take even more, wage a war against Russia, right? We think that a couple of reasons, right? Like Prime Minister has already given you the analysis of why like currently, if we withdraw right now, Ukraine is not going to have that much incentive to want to like pursue the war further, right? Because of the fact that they are fighting a defensive war and they upon like their own leaders and morality, they do not have the incentive to actually want to just like take advantage of Russia, right? Even more so when Russia takes like if it withdraws right now and maintains the resources that they have right now, but military that isn't completely defeated and actually still has some sort of defense, right? Ukraine will be disincentivized from actually pursuing the war further, right? What happened on your side? Because we both consider that it's most likely, no thank you, that it's most likely for Russia to actually lose the war, right? What does it look like? If Putin is going to push the war further and further until eventually there is actually completely no military power at all, right? You're more likely going to be left in the extremely vulnerable state, right? There's not going to be any defense even for Russia itself, right? Things like the Wagner, which has been like such like a detriment to their own military power, right? It's more likely for you at that point, the damage towards Ukraine has been and their people has been so much. There's an immense amount of anti-Russian propaganda, and seeing that Russia is in such a vulnerable state, they have the incentive to want to actually pursue further and actually take off more of their land, take off more of Russia's land, right? Okay. The same thing goes into it. Why this is not likely to happen on our side? Because if like Russia like once stops now, right? That Ukraine, most of their support is based on like sympathy garnered from other countries, right? So sympathy garnered from other countries, right? So if it's seen like there's less anti-Russian sentiment on our side because of the fact that the Russians have like actually stopped the war, then if Ukraine were to attack them at that point, that is like less likely for people want to sympathize with them, right? On your side, if Russia continuously keeps on attacking, even like once Putin wants to have this show of power of showing that Russia is better than other countries, the anti-Russian like propaganda is going to like increase to the point where even when Ukraine like attacks and they're vulnerable, there's likely no like scrutiny towards Ukraine's action like this, right? Yeah, you have one. Go ahead.
So for a brainwashed Russian with restricted source of information only through state media, right? How would they even realize Russia's military is failing and turn their back on Putin?
I think the easiest way to respond to this is the fact that they can know how their own living conditions, right? Even if you don't know that the war is fading, you're eventually going to realize the fact that food prices are getting higher, right? Putting food on the table is going to be harder. The prices are inflating, right? They are going to realize the economic effects that it has on their own country, which in turn increases the anti-Russian sentiment, right? Okay, continuing. Think about long-term versus short-term, right? The opposition wants to talk about how Putin wants to maintain power with his anti-Russian sentiment, right? We think that it's still likely that Putin is able to maintain this power, this image of him, just saying right now is not going extremely well. We still hate the West, obviously, but it is a smarter decision to go to take a step back and fight them when we are even more powerful, right? This is in turn, you are able to decrease the scrutiny from your own citizens towards Putin's position in power as well, right? So the comparative on both sides, right? We think that even if Putin is someone who prioritizes his image and prioritizes his power in the global in the global scene, right? He is likely still going to be a person who wants to maintain power in terms of tangibly, right? He's not likely going to completely throw his military to expand his military to they are at its most vulnerable and increasing the chance of his position actually being overturned by other politicians, right? So the comparative with our side is that yes, his image might suffer a little bit because from taking this step back, but when eventually the economy is able to recover, they are able to recuperate their military services. They are able to get hire different mercenaries that show that they are actually able to fight a war again. Then only on our side are you able to make sure that the anti-Russian sentiments do not reach to a tipping point even in your own country, right? But on their side, they leave their own military, their own country to be most vulnerable to other attacks by other different countries, as well as making their own citizens be against them, right? Thank you.
Thank you, DPM. Welcoming Diallo. Here.
Hi, I'll take PR's 2 first. One sec. Despite the clarification that we made in first opposition, that this is not a debate about which side better helps Russian economy or the Russian people as a whole, but rather that this debate was an active debate specific to Putin's interest, second proposition just conveniently forgot this and said that, well, it is also within Putin's interest to care about the Russian economy and Russian politics. But here's the thing, right? If it was the case that Putin cared so much about the Russian economy, he cared so much about how Russia was being perceived and alienated by the West, then why did he go to war? The reason he goes to war is because Putin doesn't care about the Russian economy, and that is not his foremost interest. His foremost interests are to keep power and to ensure that Russian sovereignty and Russian dominance and their hegemonic dominance over Eastern Europe is maintained, and that the West, and in specific NATO, doesn't encroach upon Russian sovereignty. That is the entire reason why he went to war, and that is the reason why we are having this debate. So very clearly, most of side proposition's case about, even if it is true, they get more trade, the West now considers Russia a potential ally in the future, isn't actually relevant and isn't going to win them this debate. We are the only side in this team which actually demonstrates why it is in Putin's interest, specifically as an actor, to not withdraw from this military operation. So with that being said then, the first thing I want to clarify on the our side is why exactly the status quo is more favorable than the alternative. Because I'd like to note, number one, that Putin is still in a position of absolute power in the status quo, right? Which is on our side of the house. He's not just the leader of the country, but he's also the leader of the Russian military. And the problem is that if you abandon this, you have just lost a very valuable valuable asset as Putin. Now you're saying I am no longer the person that I claim to be. I am not as strong as I told you guys what, to put it very simply, and I have lost to the West in the battle which I initiated against them. That is an incredibly large political tool that the West can use against them, but also the domestic opposition and anti-Putin sentiments can capitalize upon to remove him from that power, unresponded from second proposition. The second thing that we explained is that propositions, minute economic comparison actually means nothing to Putin, right? Because what is proposition real comparative? At best, on prop, Russia has more trade and less sanctions. On opposition, Russia is struggling and the economy is bad. But note, right, just because they prove that Russia has more trade and less sanctions, their characterization is that Russia has already gone to a point where the economy is already struggling, right? So if there is a difference in terms of economics, it's not as if they're making the Russian economy the global superpower, they're just making it significantly less worse. So like on a scale, it actually doesn't matter whether or not these individuals are being held on their side of the house because the economy is still terrible. But also we explained unresponded that it is likely that Russia maintaining this in the status quo and maintaining this operation in Ukraine will mean that in the long term, Russia is able to recuperate from these harms. That's the second thing that I want to talk about. Why is the Russian economy very likely to be able to recover economically, even if economics is a big part of this debate? So I'm just being charitable here, right? The first thing that we identify is that Russia is finding it easier and easier to cope with these sanctions that the West has placed upon them. The reason is because they have successfully been able to identify alternatives to the West in the form of China, for instance, which in recent months has demonstrated an extreme willingness to take the West's place as the dominant trader with Russia. The reason for this is twofold. Firstly, because China has an incentive to challenge Western hegemony. It is part of Xi Jinping's plan to challenge US dominance and to maintain to build China's image as a regional hegemony within the Asia and within Eastern Europe, which means that they have a direct incentive to take the place. But secondly enough, China is funnily strong enough, right, to replace the West, which is that China has an incredibly large populace and an incredibly large economy, to put things again very simply, which means that they have a demand for Russian oil to challenge the fact that the West is able to do this. So it is quite clear why the Russian economy does in fact have alternatives, not just in China, but also other nations like Belarus, which have historically and partnered with Putin and in the form of Lukashenko. So it is actually quite likely on our side of the house that the Russian economy is not going to collapse, but in fact, it is able to sustain this war machine, and Putin is able to maintain his hold on power and not have the Russian economy collapse. So even if we're taking proposition at their best, we are still ahead in this round because we're demonstrating that the economy is not going to collapse on our side of the house, which is the entire thing that the case is hinged upon. So what is the real debate that we're having here that they don't engage with? The first thing that we explain is that Putin's domestic political power and legitimacy is currently hinged upon his operation in Ukraine. So what we explain is firstly, that Putin's propaganda machine has been incredibly effective at uniting the Russian populace against Ukraine and by proxy, the West. So notice, right, we never said that all people support Putin, but the most people in Russia do. And the reason we gave for you, the reason why this is true is twofold. Firstly, because Putin has successfully fear-mongered the rise of Western values in Eastern Europe. The fact that, for instance, that he's pointing specifically towards the narrative that says the rise of Western values is exactly what is threatening Russian culture in Eastern Europe and Russian sovereignty. This is a very powerful narrative because it builds upon the existing Russian nationalist sentiment that hasn't disappeared from Soviet-era Russian politics, right? The idea of Russian sovereignty and Russian dominance within the region is incredibly strong on both sides, even if people who have an opposition to Putin. That is why he is able to unite them. This is important because when you withdraw as Putin, right, that just leaves him completely stranded because on their side of the house, Putin has just abandoned and killed his only claim to power. The only reason why he's in the position that he is in is because he's the leader of this military operation and because he believes that this is justified to protect the Russian people from more suffering at the hands of the West. So this is an incredibly powerful narrative because people genuinely believe within Russia currently that if not for this special military operation, their lives would be even worse than it is currently. So note, second proposition says that he's only suffering a little bit. This is just a blatant misrepresentation, right? It is not a little bit. We are 1 full year into the war and counting, and Putin has made it his primary objective and political objective in every single one of his speeches that he delivers, every single one of the press releases that he delivers, that the special military operation in Ukraine is the foremost interest of the Russian people and the foremost reason why he's staying in power. So it is actually incredibly dismissive for that side of the house to say that he's going to suffer a little bit if he withdraws. No, if he withdraws, he's going to lose all political legitimacy, as we explained, unresponded in first opposition. So what do we explain now? They say in response that Ukraine is successfully resisting Russian attacks because of things like Western support. Okay, the first thing I want to note is that it is true, right? We concede that Russia is not clearly winning the war. Like, we're not saying that Russia is doing well in the war here, but it is absolutely untrue that Russia is definitely going to lose. And importantly, the comparative is still okay in a world where Russian economy is suffering. In the long term, it's going to get better. But importantly, this is about Putin's interest, so it doesn't really matter, right? The first thing is that Russia is still a massive military superpower, which means that it is unlikely that they're going to lose this war in and out. They just have significantly more people than Ukraine on a very basic level. They have more guns, they have more tanks, even if the West is sending tanks as well. But the second more important thing is that the West, right, is never going to be able to take an active intervention. But before that, actually, I'll take a POI. If there is one. If not, I'll just move on. So the West is never going to be able to take an active intervention in these places for two reasons. Firstly, because the West has explicitly pledged that they're not going to put boots on the ground, right? But the second thing is that they have no pressing political incentive to intervene directly in Ukraine. The reason is because Western economies and Western politics is also suffering from things like domestic recession as a result of global inflation and also a loss of things like Russian oil, for instance. So they don't have, it is not politically favorable for the West to intervene in these cases. The best thing that they're going to do, they can send tanks, they can send money, but the pure size and scale of the Russian military means that they're still able to have some success in the region, which in fact they still have, right? They might be being pushed back a little bit, but the Russian military has been successful in capturing regions like Crimea and holding sovereignty over those important parts. These are ports that Putin actually cares about. And importantly, we never said that Ukraine is going to start invading Russia. But what we did say is that the withdrawal is going to catalyze the fall of Russia as a regional powerhouse. When you withdraw, there is no chance of you recouping the losses that you've already sunk cost into this military investment. And also, it leaves you entirely vulnerable to things like Western expansion into Eastern Europe, which is directly antithetical to the ideas and core values of Putin's regime. He wants to stop the West. He wants to make sure that NATO is not encroaching upon their sovereignty. That's why the House ignores this and makes it far worse, catalyzing the loss of Putin's power. So for all those reasons, it's quite clear why opposition take this debate.
Thank you, Diallo. Welcome in Government Whip. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
I'll pronounce she, her, and POI through mic because I won't be looking at chat. Starting my speech. Starting my speech. Panel, in this debate, we have already told you again and again that Putin's interest is related to politics and economics, right? We told you that Putin's reputation, Putin's whole incentive was all related to it being part of the economy and politics, and that is why he is the leader of Russia, right? Moving on to the first part of this debate. Firstly, in terms of Putin's reputation. So firstly, on global superpower, we say that I think both teams agree that Putin's incentive is to be a global superpower. And we say that by him stop attacking Ukraine, we say that this battle, because NATO's expansion occur within the Eastern Bloc due to people being afraid of this invasion, right? It's because people are afraid, therefore NATO helps these countries. And therefore we say that is why Putin should pull out, because by further attacking, there's no way he is gonna win that war, which both sides agrees, because NATO is already helping, and true global superpower will be NATO if Putin continues on to attack this certain country, which is Ukraine, right? Therefore, we think that on this argument, we have already won it because of the fact that how basically Putin's invasion is basically detrimental to his own reputation in terms of global superpower thing. So then why is it better on our side of the house? It's because that on our side of the house, I think it is for a fact that social media exists. Therefore, Putin will people will start to spread news that Putin is actually pulling back and withdrawing, to the fact that he is caring for his own country, and also not attacking Ukraine, which is where it is better for him, because he's not viewed as a global kind of evil person and stuff like that. Secondly, in terms of these people's or citizens' thoughts within Russia, like about Putin, is that opposition told us that the reason that they want Putin, they think Putin is fighting and like should be fighting, attacking this Ukraine, is because they want the reputation of like Putin just fighting for the country and like defending the country at like defending to for his country, right? And but on our side, we say that people are gonna like realize, right, which we did not get like proper response. In this case, Western Run already told you about how people realize how bad the economy is, that getting food on plate is already hard, and getting money is already hard in the first place. People are gonna realize that they are losing the war. And I think that this is detrimental because like people are gonna start thinking that, oh, firstly, you're not winning the war. Secondly, we are not gaining in terms of economy, right? Because on our side of the house, we have economy, and we also have this reputation of Putin pulling out and actually helping pulling out for the country instead of just like keep fighting, and in turn making people think that he's like pushing, like being dumb or like pushing too much about it. Yes. There are any three?
Yeah, your comparative is still relatively unclear, right? What about this withdrawal is suddenly going to flip the West perception of Putin such that he's now a good person, despite him already going to war in Ukraine like a year ago and now just like pulling out?
We tell you that because of this change, that people will have like this perspective that he is actually like changing, and it is like better because like it's better than you just like fighting and just keep going, even though you know that you're losing, right? It is comparatively it's better on side of opposition, side of government, because we tell you that it is like people will start to get a better living standard instead of like wasting like resources on stuff like. So onto another thing is them telling us that, oh, the reason Wagner is leaving is because it's clear that Putin is losing this war, that Russia is losing this war against Ukraine, right? And we tell you that isn't that exactly why why you should pull out, or like why Putin would pull out from this war, right? It's because that these important factor, which is like one of the most important forces in this military, is pulling out, right? It is the reason that the chance of Putin winning is lower. So therefore, that's more likely that Putin is gonna pull out, and it actually works in the interest of Putin because he can start to expand on his economy, which is the second clash of the debate, right? Economy. We tell you that which side has a better economy, right? We say that our side has better economy because we do not waste like more resources in compared to like side of opposition, where they have to waste a lot of resources in these military forces, where they have to buy these weapons or like make weapons. So even if trade exists on their side of the house, yes, trade exists. Firstly, Russia's reputation is already like bad. So like you have trades, but it's less on their side of the house, because our side of the house, there's like better trade. And on their side of the house, they're wasting a lot of resources and money on like weapons and stuff for the war. So therefore, it's like worse on their side of the house, and it's less likely that it's like not likely that they're gonna win in terms of economy. Because firstly, if you are really, really fighting to win that war, and you have to put in a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of attention or focus on that war instead of like focusing on your trade. On our side of the house, we have like Putin focusing on like the trade, right? They also mentioned about how it's not likely that Putin is gonna pull out from war, because if he care about economy and politics, then he will not be going into the war in the first place. I think this is not much relevant to this debate, because Putin, the reason that Putin goes in is probably because he feels like he is gonna win the war, or like he thinks that he has influence over this whole war. But the fact that he realized that he has like it's not true, or like he is already losing, means that it's still better on our side of the house, because he is gonna like fight for it and also like win in terms of economy and the living standards of like people in Russia, right? So even if he is not winning in terms of like this war, he's still pulling out so-called like avoiding more people dying in both from Russia and Ukraine. And he's also like expanding in terms of like economy and basically politics because he got to focus on it more. So in the comparative here, I think like side government has like better guarantee that Putin is gonna like succeed in compared to side opposition, because our side we have economy and we have reputation, while on side opposition they do not have both because of like Putin not withdrawing from this war, and also Wagner, who has already like withdrawn from the war and like from this whole war, side for side government.
Thank you, Government Whip. Welcoming Opposition Whip here.
Imagine you're Putin and you've garnered a strong image of this Russian strongman nationalist. And what government is telling you right now is that they want to withdraw and form better relations with the West for the economy, and as such, they've not focused on the ideals and identity of Putin and his propaganda. The problem here is that Putin's influence and power is crumbling, and due to multiple factors, and withdrawing from Ukraine will heavily weaken his power and his goals to stay in power, right? So there's two main issues which I've seen so far here. Is number one, which side allows Putin to stay in power more? And number two, which side has better future outcomes for Russia and for Putin overall? We don't agree with the characterization that Putin's main goal is to form better international relations and a future outcome for Russia. No, his main goal here is the fact that he wants to stay in power and continue retaining his dictatorship. So number one, which side allows Putin to stay in power more? Two prongs for this. Number one, how withdrawing from Russia will affect NATO and the Western influence. And number two, how the Wagner Group will come back into play with Putin's withdrawal. So number one, with NATO and their influence, right? NATO has actually heavily threatened Russian sovereignty in the past. Obviously, the fact that they invited Ukraine to join NATO in the first place is a sign of that. And Putin has positioned Russia as a stronghold against Western power, right? His propaganda has positioned his citizens as such in the way that they believe the West is terrible, and this war and Russia is a stronghold against Western power. And they've also positioned, what Putin has done is also position Russia, position Ukraine and the West as a common enemy to the people, right? It's essentially a very common tactic for dictators in the past. You look at Tsar Nicholas, you look at Dojo in World War II. For example, Tsar Nicholas, past Russian Tsar as well, he was able to stay in power longer due to the fact that, due to World War I, and due to the fact that he was able to get the country upon his side. If he hadn't withdrawn, if he hadn't abdicated, he would have stayed in power longer. So, by painting the West as a common enemy, right? If Putin withdraws, he's seen as much weaker, right? His strongman image is completely broken. He's going to end up worse than status quo. And Putin will likely be deposed if he withdraws, because his influence to back the war, which is the majority of the Russian population, will feel betrayed. They will riot, they will protest. They will be like, okay, Putin's not the one, Putin's not the guy. They will not support him anymore, and as such, it will lead to him potentially likely being overthrown. So we would rather a full force war and potentially them losing. That it's not confirmed that they've lost yet, by the way. That's what they failed to engage with. We rather a full force war and then potentially losing the war rather than going out meekly into the night by withdrawing, right? Because this is what the citizens feel the war is for. That is what the citizen has been positioned to feel what the war is for, right? They've been positioned to be like, okay, this war is a symbol against Western power, and if they withdraw, they're going to feel completely betrayed by Putin, and it's going to lead to him being deposed. Number two, there's the Wagner influence. The Wagner Group influence is such that if Putin withdraws, they will feel like he's essentially supporting the West, and obviously the Wagner Group are heavily anti-West, right? And they're more likely to break this agreement if they're more likely to break this agreement if if Putin withdraws from Ukraine. The Wagner Group has garnered heavy influence in Russia and is heavily pro-war. And as such, if Putin withdraws, he's going to be seen as weaker, and the Wagner Group will more likely continue his invasion. And as such, they're more likely to going to depose him in the future. So, on to the second issue now. Which side has better future outcomes for both Putin and Russia if they want to engage on the Russian side? So there are two things here. Number one, the Western impacts, and number two, the international relations in the Eastern Bloc. So number one, the Western impacts, right? The West is going to have much more bargaining power if they withdraw from, if Russia withdraws from Ukraine, right? They're going to have bargaining power of the land because Russia is going to lose a heavy amount of land if they withdraw, like they have said before. Two, they're going to likely have to pay reparations. And number three, Russia is likely going to have to export cheaper oil to the rest of Europe, right? However, if he continues the war, oil is the main thing, right? Because Russia's main export is oil, and if they do not have, if their oil export is decreased and they can't export as much, there's going to have a long-term harm upon them, right? Even if Putin stays in power, it's going to lead to poor public relations as the economy is going to worsen. As the economy is going to worsen because because oil is, as Russia's main export is not going to be exported as expensive as it could be. They might say, oh, the economy now is bad as well, but people are willing to get behind it because of war. That's what we fail to understand. But in the future, if the economy is crumbling due to Putin's withdrawal from Russia, is going to lead to worse outcomes for Putin itself. Number two, if he continues the war, however, Europe simply cannot hold on forever without Russian oil, right? Look at Germany, look at the Netherlands, 60 to 70% of the oil comes systemically from Russia, right? So if the government side do want to engage in the side of the economy, right? What we tell you is that, okay, the economy might be harmed on our side of war on our side of the house by continuously putting resources into the war, but people are willing to get behind it because of the propaganda that Putin has set into the war, because of the people feeling like, okay, this is pro-war, we need war, and as such, they're more willing to get behind the deteriorating economic condition. As compared to on their side of the house, economy is still going to be worsened after they withdraw from the war because of like what I said before, they lose land use operations and cheaper oil as well, and they have to sell oil at cheaper prices likely. However, if they continue the war, like I said, Europe cannot continue without oil, and sustainable alternatives are not working. As such, if they continue on the war, Europe is likely going to have to make compromises with Russia in the future, which is likely going to improve their economy overall because they have more exports for their oil. Another thing is that the international relations in the Eastern Bloc, right? So it reduces, if they withdraw from Ukraine, it's going to heavily reduce their influence in the Eastern Bloc. And one of Putin's main goals since his rise to power was to recreate the Iron Curtain from the Soviet Union, right? From the east to west, separating the east and west. By withdrawing from Europe, they lose regions like the Donbass, they lose Crimea, they have less influence in Belarus, etc. Right? And this completely loses Putin's goals, which has propelled him to his position currently, right? It's going to be much worse for his supporters, because supporters are again going to feel like they've been betrayed, and it's going to lead to him being dethroned overall because of that, right? They also talk about how it'd be better relations if they join the West. However, two responses to this. Number one, three responses to this. They don't want to join the West. It's not in Russia's interest, Putin's interest to join the West, because that he completely hates the West, right? And as such, Putin is not going to want to follow and build better relations with the West, because that's just simply not going to be his goals. It's not what his supporters want. And if he chooses to do so, it's going to lead to his supporters feeling like they have, again, once more betrayed him. Also, they've also pushed this idea of how Ukraine is going to go to the offensive. Again, we've never said Ukraine is going to go to the offensive. This is a completely superfluous thing that they made up. It's pretty much half their case that, oh, Ukraine's going to go to offensive and on our side, and it's not going to go offensive on their side of the house, so it's going to be better. Again, we've never pushed down upon them. We know Ukraine going on offensive is completely stupid. So their best case is essentially, they get some of the benefit, they may get better economy, that they may get a better economy, which, you know, we believe is a wash at best for them. They may get a better economy, Putin's reputation will still be heavily damaged, and his reputation will go down. Our worst case, Russia may lose the war and they may have a worse economy, but Putin will stay in power, his interests will be protected, and his overall ideals and goals will be perpetuated. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. To end opposition case, I'll reply.
Okay. The first thing I want to do in this speech is just to interrogate side proposition's winning pathway of rebuilding the Russian economy and how that actually manifests and weighs up against other points in this debate. So what we pointed out as early as first opposition, right, is that this argument about rebuilding the Russian economy is not necessarily an intuitive claim, right? And the fact that side proposition doesn't actually mechanize how Russia is going to recuperate from this loss, the massive billions of dollars that have already been, sunk cost into the war effort, and the fact that Putin has already engineered and sacrificed a lot of economic gain in the short term for the purposes of putting those resources towards the war effort, means that the Russian economy in the status quo on both sides is facing a lot more than just the amount of money that they're currently putting towards the war. I think the reason why this is important is because side proposition needs to explain why things like stopping the current funding or at least improving trade marginally is going to now revive the Russian economy in a way that drastically benefits Putin, right? But I think the real burden in this debate that they failed to prove is twofold. Firstly, that Putin does in fact prioritize the health of his economy over that of his strength and political power domestically, which they haven't been able to prove. And secondly, that the economic losses on our side of the house are going to be significantly worse, such that he has no choice but to be deposed. But they fail to meet both those burdens because the first thing that we explain is that obviously they don't prove that the Russian economy is going to collapse on our side of the house. And the reason is because they don't actually respond to us when we explain that the existence of alternative trading powers, such as China and other emerging rogue powers, are currently already in the process of replacing European Western states like Germany, or even in fact, the United States. And the incentive for them to do this is because they understand that in a battle between Russia and the United States, it is not going to be the case that Russia is going to cease to exist, which makes it directly in the incentives of an actor such as China, which cares about attacking the Western's hegemony over the world, to invest heavily in Russian economies and invest heavily in trying to replace the West as the predominant trading partner. So those were the real incentives that we identified, that the Russian economy wouldn't actually be that bad. But on their side of the house, they even in their best case, in which our economy is actually really, really bad, they still don't identify the link between that and Putin's interest and personal interest to remain powerful, which is something that first proposition already agrees, right? Which is that this debate is about Putin's interest and he cares about maintaining power. So very clearly, even if the winning party on that side of the house is the Russian economy and is a little bit better or even significantly better, they are still not winning this debate. The way we actually demonstrated other than that is that Putin has demonstrated that he'd rather die than concede to the West. And in proposition's best case, we explained that power with Putin is not actually contingent upon him winning the war. In fact, even if he loses the war, a significant portion of the Russian people are still more than happy to back the effort. And the reason we give for this was actually more nuanced than they thought, because it wasn't that people care so much about Putin specifically, but is that the way in which Putin's propaganda machine has been so effective and pernicious is that he has convinced the Russian public such that they perceive the comparative of Western values if Putin retreats from these regions as a worse outcome than life currently under the current military operation in Ukraine. So the comparative is that he successfully fear-mongered a culture of hating the West. And obviously, proposition doesn't explain why Russia is going to completely lose. And in fact, it is quite unfeasible. At best, on our side of the house, Russia is going to be forced back to original borders. And as they explain, Ukraine is not going to invade them. So even if we lose, we are still the side of the house that is closest to protecting Putin's interest as an actor. But other things that we explain is that obviously Putin is at a particularly vulnerable point at this specific stage. And the fact that, him pulling out of a war that has already been going on, and has already killed hundreds and thousands of Ukrainians, doesn't improve his image as an international actor. It is not as if the West is going to say, wow, Putin is admitting that he is wrong. It is more likely that they perceive it as Putin is so weak that he is forced to concede. So on the basis of international image, there is really no difference in this debate, and it's far more preferable for him to continue this war effort. So for those reasons, we're quite proud to oppose.
Thank you. I'll reply to end the debate. Gov reply here.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The link that opposition keeps on demanding for us to prove about how the economy actually relates to Putin's interest is simple, right? It's about the influence. They have even a huge part of their case. It's about how the influence Putin has over the support of the Russian people with anti-NATO and anti-European sentiments is the biggest part of Putin's interest, right? And we already given to you since the Prime Minister on how, because of the economy that is currently becoming even worse on in Russia, that anti-Putin sentiments within the Russian country is already appearing, right? Couple contradictions that I've made, right? They talked about how the majority of people are still probably going to be, because of Putin's fearmonger, going to have is perfectly fine with supporting Putin's and his pursuit of war, right? But in the same breath, they've also said the fact that there are people who have who are becoming having more anti-Putin sentiments due to the fact that he is losing in the war, right? We don't opposition does not explain why there's no possibility for these people to grow in nature, right? Why this amount of people cannot increase when they actually eventually realize, wow, Putin is actually losing to these people, right? Putin is losing the war. Putin is making our lives exponentially worse and continuing with this, right? We think that only on they not prove to us why, if there is already people who have changed their minds from being extremely on the propaganda for being anti-Western, etc., to change their mind because of the situations that Putin is now eventually in, that they can that other people will not change, right? The only assertion that they have given is that right now majority of the people are still anti-propaganda, right? Which we have already anti-West, right? Which we have already proven to you. But if eventually Putin still goes on with this war, exhausts all of the resources they have for military support, for things and eventually that bleeds into things like the Russian economy, right? The support and influence of his big Russian man image is going to be diminished, right? Because of the fact that there will be more anti-Putin propaganda and sentiment within his own people, right? That covers the biggest point that opposition wants to come out about influence, right? And then they did not engage with us on the point of why it is more likely that the West is going to, if the fact that on both sides the West is still going to have anti-Putin sentiments, right? Why is so much more detrimental on their side if they're going to eventually exhaust all of their resources in this military, in this war, and leaves the military to be in a vulnerable state, to be attacked and to be taken advantage of by countries with anti-Russian sentiments, right? Like Ukraine, the US, right? They not engage on this point, right? The only thing that we said is that we will somehow make the West like us, right? We told you that this is the best case scenario, right? That if they are conservatives even in US who are able to try to paint UK in a better Russia in a better light, right? Even if these people does not exist, and it was given to you in our previous speaker's speech, even if these people do not exist, we think that it's significantly better that the Putin does not leave things like his military in an extremely vulnerable position to be attacked by other countries, right? To not instigate the anti-Russian sentiments even further than they already are, right? Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you for the debate. Cross floors, shake hands, and we'll be announcing the results here after all rounds are done. Thank you so much for the wonderful debate. I think the panel can go into room 1 to deliberate.
Thanks for the round.
Thank you guys. Thank you.